Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of pure, unfiltered precision.
Right. It feels like engineering.
Exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it. The evidence is undeniably right there on the screen.
It's totally binary. I mean, the bone is broken or the bone is not broken, and we naturally crave that level of, visible, indisputable categorization in all areas of science.
But the moment you step into applied behavior analysis, that X-ray machine just shatters. We're suddenly dealing with the murky, really subjective world of human behavior.
Oh, absolutely. It gets messy fast.
So for everyone navigating Domain C of the BACB Test Content Outline right now, the RBTs, the BCBA students, and behavior analysts preparing for certification, this deep dive is basically your manual for fixing that X-ray machine.
Yeah, and we are pulling from a really comprehensive stack of sources today to do that. We're looking at mock exams, ethics workbooks, study guides, and the foundational texts.
Like the Cooper, Heron, and Heward book.
Exactly, the Cooper text. And we're using all of this to master section C.1, which is creating operational definitions of behavior. And for you listening, I mean, this isn't just theory.
No, definitely not.
This is the literal foundation of how behavior is measured objectively and, consistently across different observers and settings.
It really is a foundational superpower in ABA, because without it, you just can't measure behavior objectively.
Yeah.
But before we can even measure it, we have to know exactly what counts as a behavior, right?
Right. What does a good definition actually look like? Well, the sources, especially Cooper, Heron, and Heward, they break down the 3 mandatory characteristics.
The big 3.
The big 3. It has to be objective, clear, and complete.
Okay, so objective, that basically means we stick strictly to the 5 senses, right?
Yes, exactly. It refers only to observable characteristics. No feelings, no inferred intent.
Which sounds easy, but it's incredible how quickly that rule goes out the window the minute a practitioner is actually in a stressful clinical environment.
Oh, 100%. We default to our natural human language. We describe internal states because, well, that's how we survive socially.
Yeah, we constantly hear practitioners say things like, oh, the client was frustrated or anxious during a session.
But the mechanism of data collection breaks down entirely when we use those words. If you put frustration on a data sheet, you've completely destroyed the reliability of your data.
Because my visual for frustration might be, I don't know, a client letting out a heavy sigh.
Right, whereas a parent's visual for frustration might be the client throwing a chair across the room.
That's a huge difference. And that's exactly why the clear requirement exists.
Exactly. A clear definition has to be unambiguous. Any experienced observer should be able to read it and immediately know what to look for without having to guess what the original author meant.
But, delving into the sources, the complete requirement seems to be where the most dangerous boundary issues happen in practice.
Yeah, completeness is tricky. A complete definition has to establish strict boundaries. It has to detail what the behavior actually is, but equally importantly, it must explicitly state what the behavior is not.
Right. So consider the behavior of punching. If you define punching merely as a closed fist moving quickly through space and making contact with another person,
You've created a massive loophole.
you really have. You just accidentally defined an aggressive high five or like a celebratory fist bump.
And that's why the definition has to actively exclude those variations. It has to draw a hard boundary line.
Book specifying the force of the impact.
Yes, or the context or the specific body parts targeted, just to ensure observers aren't tallying a high five as an aggressive strike.
Which brings us to a really crucial rule in the literature for establishing that baseline boundary, the dead man's test.
Ah, yes, the classic. The rule is simple but absolute. If a dead man can do it, it is not a behavior.
I always love this concept. The classic example from our foundational texts perfectly illustrates this. So, a dead man can wear glasses.
Right. Being in a static state of having glasses resting on your face does not pass the test.
But a dead man cannot put on glasses. The physical interaction with the environment, the reaching, the grasping, the placing, that is the actual behavior.
And yet, we constantly see intervention plans targeting goals like compliance or staying seated.
Right. A dead man is perfectly compliant.
Exactly. A dead man can stay seated indefinitely. Those are states of being. They're not observable actions.
So let's apply that to a really common scenario for you listening. If I'm consulting with a family and they tell me their goal is for their child to have good manners at the dinner table.
A very common goal.
Super common.
Yeah.
And colloquially, we all understand the general vibe of good manners. But playfully challenging you here, if I say a kid is having good manners, isn't that clear enough for most parents?
Practically, maybe, but clinically, if you write good manners on a data sheet, you're setting the entire intervention up for failure.
Because it's too vague.
Because good manners is a general class of responses. It's not a specific measurable action. It totally fails the test of objectivity.
So how do we fix it?
We have to drill down into the mechanics of what the family actually wants to see. We break that abstract concept down into an objective chunk.
Like what?
Like excusing oneself from the table by saying, "May I please be excused," and waiting for an affirmative response before standing up.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. That immediately passes the dead man's test. It relies on the five senses, is totally clear to any observer walking into the room, and it sets a complete boundary.
Exactly. So once we actually isolate a living, measurable behavior, the sources force us down one of two paths to categorize it.
Topography or function.
Right. And the path you choose completely dictates how you measure and eventually treat the behavior.
So let's start with function.
Function-based definitions categorize the behavior strictly by its effect on the environment. It focuses entirely on the outcome.
Like, why is this action happening and what does it achieve?
Yes. The Cooper text provides an excellent clinical example of a function-based definition for hand-to-mouth behavior.
I remember this one.
Yeah, they define it as any contact of the fingers, hand, or wrist with the mouth, lips, or tongue.
The brilliance of that definition is just how broad it is regarding the form. Notice how it doesn't limit the observer to watching for just one specific movement.
Right. If the definition rigidly stated index finger touching the lips, and the client suddenly switches to using the back of their hand...
Technically, under that rigid definition, the behavior has stopped.
Exactly. But the actual clinical issue, the contact with the mouth, is obviously still happening.
Function captures the entire response class, regardless of how the client achieves it.
Which is why function is incredibly efficient. But we can't always rely on function.
Right, which brings us to the second path. Topography-based definitions.
We define the behavior purely by its physical shape or form.
I always conceptualize this through a true crime lens. So topography is the mugshot, the physical description of what the suspect looks like.
I like that.
But function is the motive, why they committed the act and what they got out of it.
That's a great analogy. And we rely on topography, the mugshot, when the specific physical form is the entire point of the intervention, particularly in skill acquisition.
Think about teaching a child to brush their teeth or tie their shoes or swing a golf club.
Golf is a perfect example.
Yeah, if you define playing golf purely by its function, which is getting the small ball into a hole, you could just walk up to the hole, reach into your pocket, and drop the ball in.
You achieve the function.
Exactly. But you aren't playing golf. The specific physical movements, the grip, the swing, the stance, the topography is the behavior we actually care about.
Topography also serves a really critical role when we're dealing with severe behaviors, where we literally cannot safely observe the function to measure it.
Yeah, this is where the proxy functions for safety come in.
Right. The Spanish version of the Cooper text brings up a vital point regarding elopement, or fugue.
The natural function of elopement is that the child escapes a demand or, gets lost in the environment.
And we obviously cannot let a child run out the front door and into traffic just so we can tally a data point on our clipboard.
Yeah, just to confirm the function, that would be completely unethical.
So we have to use a topographical proxy to ensure safety while maintaining rigorous data collection.
The sources cite Tarbox and colleagues for this, right?
They do. Tarbox solved this by defining elopement topographically as moving more than 1.5 meters away from the therapist without permission.
By defining the behavior using that exact physical measurement in space, practitioners can intervene and collect accurate data before the dangerous function is ever achieved.
It is a brilliant way to bridge the gap between clinical safety and objective measurement. It completely shifts how we approach high-risk behaviors.
Okay, but pivoting from clinical safety to the reality of the BACB exam, we see how these rules are used to test a practitioner's discipline.
Oh, the exam writers love to set traps. They specifically prey on our instinct to use subjective language or to prioritize clinical feelings over measurement rules.
Because test writers know that humans naturally want to ascribe intent to actions. The moment a definition includes words like lonely, aggressive, frustrated, or intent to hurt.
The test taker has fallen into the trap.
Let's analyze a specific mock exam scenario from our stack of sources. So, you're asked to identify the most observable and measurable definition among three options.
Okay, lay them out.
Option A, A student leaves their seat. Option B. A student rushes through work with no attempt at quality. Option C. A student wants to grab things from peers.
Well, option C is an immediate disqualification.
Because of the word want.
Exactly. Wants is a desire. It's an internal state. We have no scientific instrument to measure a want.
Okay, so C is out. But option B is much more insidious. Rushing through work with no attempt at quality sounds exactly like a legitimate problem a teacher would report.
It does, but the mechanics of the definition are entirely subjective. Rushing is a relative concept.
Right. A student finishing a worksheet in 5 minutes might seem incredibly fast to a teacher, but it might just be the baseline normal speed for that specific student.
And quality. That is a massive value judgment. One observer's acceptable quality is another observer's messy failure.
Which leaves option A. A student leaves their seat.
The physical body breaks contact with the chair. It is totally devoid of value judgments, it ignores intent, and it is entirely measurable by any observer in the room.
But the exam writers push this even further. They put our clinical empathy in direct conflict with the rules of measurement.
They really do. Let's look at the scenario in the sources. We'll call it the Tiffany question.
Oh, this one is tough.
You have to choose the goal that is observable and measurable. Option 1. Tiffany will not daydream during independent work. Option 2. Tiffany will throw objects that are smaller than her hand.
Wait, isn't throwing objects smaller than her hand a terrible, unsafe goal for a student?
Many test takers instinctively recoil from option 2. Throwing objects is a maladaptive, potentially dangerous behavior.
Right. The clinical instinct is to reject it because we don't want to encourage throwing. We want to help Tiffany focus, so we naturally gravitate toward option 1.
But the question is not asking for a good or safe clinical goal. It is only asking for a measurable one.
And you cannot observe a daydream.
Exactly. You might see a student staring out a window, but you have no scientific way of knowing if they are daydreaming about a video game or, mentally calculating the answer to a complex math problem.
Throwing a small object, however, is a physical action occurring in the environment. It passes the dead man's test. It is objective.
The exam forces you to separate your desire to help the client from the cold, hard mechanics of data collection. Intent, feelings, and daydreaming are subjective. Throwing an object is objective. If you cannot observe it, it cannot exist on the datasheet.
So we've stripped away the internal states, we've navigated the topographical safety proxies, and we've avoided the subjective exam traps. But what is the actual so what here?
Why do we go through all this exhausting linguistic gymnastics?
Exactly, because without it, the rest of the treatment plan just crumbles.
That's because a treatment plan is only as reliable as its inter-observer agreement.
Yeah.
Or IOA.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
IOA is essentially the mathematical believability of your data. If two different people are watching a client, a clear operational definition ensures they both tally the exact same number of occurrences.
If your operational definition is weak, your IOA collapses, and the entire intervention crumbles with it. I kind of view it like navigating with a poorly drawn map.
How so?
If I give 3 different people a map and simply tell them to go to the big tree, they're going to end up in 3 entirely different forests.
Because they all have different internal definitions of what big means and what type of tree you're talking about?
Exactly. The operational definition is providing the exact GPS coordinates.
Let's visualize how the absence of those coordinates destroys a graph. Imagine 2 therapists observing the same client during a session. If the operational definition for aggression simply says client hits, Therapist A might record 4 instances because they're only counting hard strikes that leave a mark.
Right.
But Therapist B might record 30 instances because they are counting every single time the client's hand taps them, regardless of force.
And that data is fundamentally useless.
Yeah.
You can't track a trend, you can't analyze an antecedent, and you certainly can't determine if your intervention is actually reducing the behavior.
Not if the baseline data is entirely dependent on the personal interpretation of whoever happens to be holding the clipboard that day.
And that specific discrepancy leads directly to the phenomenon of treatment drift.
Treatment drift is a nightmare. When an operational definition lacks strict, unambiguous boundaries, the way staff implements the intervention slowly morphs over time.
A vague definition basically operates like a clinical game of telephone.
Yeah.
The BCBA writes the initial plan in January. But by June, Therapist 1 is implementing the reinforcement schedule slightly differently than Therapist 2.
And Therapist 3 has invented their own criteria entirely because the original definition left room for interpretation.
So the intervention drifts further and further away from the original protocol. Suddenly, the client stops making progress, the data looks chaotic, and the BCBA can't figure out why the plan failed.
But the failure wasn't the intervention itself. The failure was the initial definition.
The source is, quote, mathematician Lord Kelvin on this exact principle, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Referenced right in the Cooper text. He said, unless you can express what you're talking about in numbers and measure it, your knowledge is poor and unsatisfactory.
That quote is the ultimate takeaway for anyone listening to this right now. Whether you're writing a behavior intervention plan or you're just tracking a simple habit for yourself, you have to be able to prove mathematically that what you are doing is working.
You can't just look a parent, a stakeholder, or a teacher in the eye and say, well, it feels like they're having a better week.
The data has to speak for itself, and the data only exists if the definition is bulletproof.
So, to do a rapid-fire recap of the mechanics we've pulled from the sources today, always run your target behavior through the dead man's test.
Ensure your definitions are objective, clear, and complete by strictly relying on the 5 senses.
And explicitly establish what the behavior is not.
Categorize the behavior accurately by choosing between function, the outcome and effect on the environment, or topography, the physical shape and form in space.
And when you finally sit down for that exam, do not let subjective words trick you. Avoid traps dealing with intent or feelings.
Mastering C.1 is just the beginning of this sequence. You'll want to stay tuned for our next deep dive, where the journey through Domain C continues with Section C, Part 2.
Right, distinguishing among direct, indirect, and product measures of behavior.
We will explore the mechanical differences between observing a behavior happen live in the moment versus measuring the permanent products and physical evidence it leaves behind.
It's going to be a great one. And for all the RBTs, BCBA students, and behavior analysts listening, you can visit www.amethysttherapyservices.com or contact info@amethysttherapyservices.com for more resources to support your certification journey.
Building this technical foundation is the hardest part of the process, but it is exactly what separates an adequate practitioner from an exceptional one.
Couldn't agree more.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought based on everything we've unpacked today. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about the absolute necessity of stripping away human assumptions, ignoring emotions, and completely disregarding presumed intentions when we define another person's behavior.
It's very cold and calculated.
It is. So here is the question to mull over on your own before your next clinical session. By forcing ourselves to strip away all assumptions and refuse to acknowledge the anger or loneliness behind a behavior, by strictly reducing human action to nothing more than physical movements in space, do we risk losing a piece of the human experience? Or, by completely removing our own personal biases and emotional judgments from the equation, does cold, hard objectivity actually make us far more empathetic?